Greetings to Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Research Advisor at Khazanah Research Institute, Professor Dr. Melati Nungsari, Deputy CEO, Asia School of Business, Associate Professor of Economics, and Research Affiliate at MIT Sloan School of Management. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today. We are especially honored to host Dr. Guy Standing, a globally respected economist and socialist whose research continues to influence how we think about labor, inequality, and the changing structure of the global economy. Selamat datang again, and a very warm welcome to today's seminar titled Rentier Capitalism, Stagnation, and the Precariat. To officially begin our event, I would now like to invite Professor Dr. Melati Nungsari to deliver her welcoming remarks. Please welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you. This will take like 2 minutes, but I wanted to welcome you to the beautiful campus of Asia School of Business. If you have any problems with sort of getting around, I know this place can be a bit of a maze. You can feel free to ask one of our team members. Zara is at the back. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background to what ASB is, because maybe for some of you this is the first time that you set foot in this building. So we're a business school specializing in graduate level management and also business education in Asia. We've been here for 10 years, so this is our 10th year anniversary this year, and we're very welcome. We welcome everybody today, Dr. Guy Standing, Prof. Jomo, of course, and our dean is here as well, Prof. Joe Chirian, to this place where we can share ideas and talk about interesting things that are happening around the world, and just to learn from each other. So I welcome all of you to ASB, and let us know if we can help you with anything else. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Melati, for the welcoming speech. Today's program will commence with a seminar by Dr. Guy Standing, followed by a rich exchange with our distinguished discussants, and concluding with a Q&A session. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Guy Standing.
Well, thanks very much, and it's great to be back in Malaysia. When I first came, I was an economic advisor in the EPU, and I met a young rebel, and he was a young and upcoming rebel, and I liked him because I felt like a young upcoming rebel myself, and it's a great pleasure to see him again. Jomo, so that's been a pleasure to come back to see him. Today I'm going to try and give a summary of the work that I've been doing since we met in the 1980s. And at the time I was working in the International Labour Organization, but I was seconded here and I did what I think is still the biggest enterprise survey in Malaysia. And it was very useful as part of a educational development myself. I went on to do similar surveys in many other countries. And it was quite clear that the labor market was developing in profoundly different ways than had been presumed in the development literature. They were not creating a proletariat. They were sort of developing an approach where they were casualizing people. And I always remember going to Motorola, a big company that had about 6,000 workers. And it was all of the workers were about 16, 17, 18-year-old women, young women, from the kampongs. And I asked one of the managers, he had a red coat on, and all the workers were in blue. I said, how is this process going on? And he says, well, we don't expect these girls, he said, to stay more than 2 years, because after about 2 years, they have eyesight problems and they have back problems, and so we send them back to the kampongs. I think he thought I was on his side. Of course, it was a process which reflected what I've taken forward and I've seen elsewhere in the world. And it was part of the development of the Precariat. I didn't conceptualize it as the Precariat at that time, but gradually it evolved, and I'll come to that in the course of my talk. Now, it's always nice to have anniversaries. And this year is the anniversary of 50 years since Margaret Thatcher was elected as leader of the British Conservative Party. And she had what's called a shadow cabinet. It was an outside the government at that time. She was the opposition. And she went into the first meeting of her shadow cabinet and thumped down a book by Friedrich Hayek, The Constitution of Liberty. Now, the story is she took it out of her handbag, but I always doubted that because if you have seen the book, it's 576 pages, and it's a hell of a book to put in a handbag. But anyhow, she thumped it down and she said, "This is what we believe." And I think that marked the beginning of the economics revolution, symbolically, because Hayek had been a rebel when, in 1947, he set up the Mont Pelerin Society in a village quite close to where I live today, in Switzerland. And there were 38 rebels, economists mostly, who were on the far right, politically and ideologically. When Thatcher came in and Reagan came in, those members of the Mont Pelerin Society went from being total outsiders, ignored, mocked. When I was a student at Cambridge, we regarded them as sort of out-of-date, old fogies. And suddenly they became the masters of the universe. No fewer than 8 of that 38 went on to receive Nobel Prizes in economics, including Hayek and the youngest member, Milton Friedman. And they launched, in effect, a new disembedded phase of what I've called the global transformation. And this draws on the model of the development of capitalism that's embedded in a wonderful book by a person who knew Hayek, Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation. Now, the irony is that in the 1930s, Karl Polanyi and Friedrich Hayek were both in a business institute in Vienna. And you can picture that each morning they were being good Austrians, they were nice, polite people. They would walk past each other, doff their hats, and nothing else. Now, I have that on the authority of Karl Polanyi's daughter. So I wrote the book, Work After Globalization, it's called, which I used Karl Polanyi's framework and said that his model had been somewhat teleological because he had seen capitalism developing in the 19th century with a period of free market ideology resulting in the takeover by finance, merchant capital, he called it, until there were so many inequalities and insecurities multiplying that there was, in his words, the threat of the annihilation of civilization. And Karl Polanyi said at that point, there is a choice. Either we go further to the right into a new dark fascism, Bolshevism, and all the things like that, or there's a new progressive, re-embedded process, a new progressive agenda. And I said to Karl Polanyi's daughter, who is an economist, that he had thought that his transformation after the Second World War was the end point. And I said, that's contradictory to dialectical thinking. There will continue to be a new transformation. And I'm immensely proud of the fact that when I wrote my book on the global transformation, Kerry Polanyi asked to endorse it and did so, because I believe this is what we've been experiencing in the last 50 years. The disembedded phase of the global transformation. And that's the background context of what I'm going to talk about. Now, the Mont Pelerin Society people, all of whom became household names among economists and politicians around the world, basically said they were in favor of free markets. Free markets and private property rights. And they were in favor of competition and, in their view, liberty that came with it. It always struck me as an inherent contradiction. And it's quite clear that that is what it has been. And I want to talk in this framework in terms of 7 lies. And after the 7 lies, I will come to, I thought it was going to be 7, but it actually turns out to be 8, unfortunately. So 8 outcomes. The 7 lies begin with the fact that they claim to be promoting a free market economy on a global scale. The outcome, in fact, has been the most unfree market economy of all time. And that I took forward into the book called The Corruption of Capitalism. I wanted to call the book Rentier Capitalism. And my publisher said, Guy, you can't publish a book called Rentier Capitalism. No one will understand what that means. So you can't. And he read it, and he said, well, corruption. And I said, no, it's not really about corruption. And then I stupidly said, well, I suppose it is, in the sense that they say they're in favor of free markets, but actually they're doing the opposite. And that's a corruption. And I stupidly gave in. I will die regretting that. But that aside, we have a system where we don't have had a period of deregulation. You know the word that's bandied around. We have had a period of profound re-regulation in which liberalization for the powerful has corresponded to tighter regulation over workers, over civilians, and so on. That part of that ideology was that there was no need for antitrust regulations because the presumption in a free market is that if you have monopolies, they're what called Schumpeterian monopolies, which will be whittled away by competition, and therefore you don't need to worry about it. This was a lie, and anybody can show that that is a lie and has been proven to be incorrect. Now, the second lie, and I'm being brief on some of these because I want to get to the chase, I want to get to my main points. The second lie was that intellectual property rights are desirable because they promote growth and markets. And the lie is that, of course, intellectual property rights contradicts the very idea of a free market. And the big changes that took place were the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which profoundly affected the functional distribution of income. What the Bayh-Dole Act did, for the first time, was saying that publicly funded research and development in universities and research institutions, paid for by taxpayers, in effect, could be taken by private capital and used and turned into monopolistic profits. And so we had a situation where, in effect, huge subsidy was provided by the state to corporations. And as a result of that, corporations started to do less and less of their own research and development. Practically disappeared in American companies. You'll find that today, and it's documented in the books. Now, the Bayh-Dole Act was copied in many countries, including Malaysia, Japan, Brazil, China, etc. But the big change came in TRIPS in 1994. And that links with the third lie, but I'll come back to that in a second. TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, was actually shaped by a group of 6 chief executives of American multinational corporations. And ironically, the principal architect of TRIPS was the chief executive of Pfizer, which is very remarkable given COVID and the billions that Pfizer earned as a result of TRIPS. Because TRIPS essentially globalized the US property rights system. And what it did was it meant that anybody who had a patent had a guaranteed monopoly profit for 20 years, and in pharmaceuticals, maybe evergreening a further 20 years. Well, of course, if you have a monopoly guaranteed, that's not a free market. That's junk. And the claim, of course, was that if you had strong property rights, it would induce greater innovation, greater research, blah, blah, blah. But as I show in the book, there is no evidence that the result has been increased innovation or increased growth. On the contrary. Now, TRIPS should be seen in the following couple of statistics. Before 1995, fewer than 1 million patents were filed each year. Today, over 3.5 million patents are filed every year, and there are 19 million plus patents in force around the world. Every day, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk should bow down in the direction of Geneva, where TRIPS was passed, because they would have a fraction of the money that they have had it not been for the passage of TRIPS. But the Americans who created TRIPS made one hubristic error. Because in 1994, China was not a member of GATT, which became the WTO in 1995, and they thought, of course, that China didn't matter. But China was waking up. And in 2001, China joined the WTO. And the changing nature of global capitalism began at that time. Today, China files each year 3 times as many patents as the United States, and more patents than all the rest of the world put together. That's an indication of a later point I want to make about the rising rentier state. Now, the third lie was that the international architecture was promoting growth, a world order that was reliant in part with the Pax Americana as the global policeman, but the architecture was promoting growth and development. But there's no evidence that that has been the case. The architecture is very interesting. I live outside Geneva, as I said, and when I was first there, the major buildings were the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, the World Bank, a few others. And there was a little body down the road in a back street, which had a man as Director General who was regarded as a petty crook. We all laughed at him. He had a certain corrupt tendencies, shall we put it that way. We didn't talk about it except to laugh because it sounded, the acronym sounded like a detergent that you would buy and clean your clothes. It's called WIPO. Now, at that time, WIPO was not really, we didn't know where it was most of the time. Today, if you come to Geneva, WIPO is the center of Geneva and has the most beautiful buildings, the biggest building, biggest staff, etc. It's the World Intellectual Property Organization. And the architecture has changed, but has been used systematically to promote what I'm calling rentier capitalism around the world. Because basically it has been a set of institutions that have been promoting private property rights fundamentally, to the detriment of market forces. And the one that I like to highlight, because I wish it applied to me and maybe you as well, is the ISDS. The ISDS is the Investor-State Dispute Settlement. Now, this mechanism, which is part of this international architecture, and there are lots of others, I know you're familiar with it, but I discuss them. But the ISDS essentially says that if any government introduces any reform that affects the future profits of a multinational, the multinational can sue the government for compensation. Now, I wish I'd had one of those. I mean, you know, because many governments do things every day that adversely affect my future income. Imagine if we were able to sue them and get compensation. We'd be all very wealthy. Well, that, of course, has been the case. And there have been a huge number of cases where the multinationals have sued governments and have been able to do so because they get to appoint the judges. Did you hear what I said? I wish I could do that too. Can you imagine? That's what Donald Trump aspires to do. It's ridiculous. So we have a lie there. And there is no evidence that these institutions have increased growth. The next lie is that subsidies, government subsidies, have developed as a way of boosting growth. On the contrary, the evidence overwhelming that in fact they've been regressive, flowed mainly to big corporations and big interests. The one that exercises my mind more than any other is the amount of subsidies given to fisheries and interests in the sea. And I wrote a book called The Blue Commons, Rescuing the Economy of the Sea. It's a passion of mine that I've been doing work on it over my life. I brought it all together in the book because what I think is the most decisive piece of that architecture, which gets hardly any attention from anybody, is UNCLOS. UNCLOS is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which came into being in 1982 after a protracted period of 15 years of negotiations. And it was the biggest enclosure in history because it converted what had been the commons, the sea, which covers 71% of the world, into state property, large part. 138 million square kilometers became state property. The Americans did extremely well. They got 12 million square kilometers. France did well. Other countries have less well, but did well. Under UNCLOS, China got under 1 million. Right? Come back to that, relevant. Malaysia, incidentally, got more sea than land as a result of UNCLOS. You have more sea than land. But what UNCLOS did was essentially make a bargain. A bargain. Countries got certain things in return for certain things. I'll come back to that later. But it enabled countries to use their corporations to have access to the seas of other countries. The privatization process started. The next lie is that government and finance corporations want to eradicate debt. Now, I don't know if any of you are in finance, but if you notice, financial institutions make a lot of their money from putting people into debt. That's their raison d'etre. And they don't want people to be out of debt. On the contrary. I mean, you can't turn a lion into a lamb. And a result of that has been that public debt has risen, corporate debt has risen, household debt's risen, all over the world. All over the world. And it's a part of the story to which I want to come as quickly as possible. The sixth lie is a very convenient one because it stems from the Austrian School of Economics. And it's the mentor of Friedrich Hayek was an economist called von Mises. And von Mises' contribution to the economic science was that he said that anything that has no price has no value. So a park has no value. A library, a public library, has no value. Therefore, you should convert public goods, public assets, into private, because then they have value. And then they will contribute to growth. And this fetish of growth, which began in the 70s, really, goes along with the belief that you should privatize all public assets because that will increase growth and that will increase value. The World Bank and the IMF have made the extension of private property rights a locus of their strategy for the last 50 years in particular. So everywhere you go, they have introduced implicit or explicit conditionality to privatize what was the commons. And this has been a particularly virulent practice with everything to do with the sea. So around the world, we've seen a disappearance of mangroves, for example. I'm giving an example. Simply because for foreign aid, the bank has said, well, if you privatize these mangroves and they're converted into prawn farms for export, then we'll give you aid. It's an example that I can give 20 others. And as a result, there's been a loss of the commons with all the disastrous out-migration, distress migration from sea communities and so on. The lie is as big a lie as you can get. And the seventh lie, and you'll be glad to know that it's the last of my 7 lies, is the mantra that work is the best route out of poverty. You've heard that, I expect, a few places. Work is the best route. But the irony is, of course, that over the period where this ideology has prevailed, we've seen the opposite. More and more jobs in more and more countries pay wages that do not enable people to escape poverty, but do enable them to get into debt. So that lie is one that is particularly close to my heart as a specialist on labor and work issues. And now we come to the outcomes. The first outcome, is hyper-financialization of the world economy. And hyper-financialization in which governments have surrendered monetary policy to central banks, and behind them all the powerful financial institutions. I had a long debate in Davos a few years ago with Larry Fink, who was televised, if any of you want to have a few minutes of laughter or whatever. Larry Fink is the chief executive of BlackRock. And BlackRock I regard as the most powerful financial institution in the world today. It owns, through its algorithm Aladdin, about 20% of the world's equities and has access to control in many other areas. When Trump was worrying about taking over Panama, Larry Fink phoned him in the White House and said, "Don't worry, Mr. President, I'll buy the ports for you," which he's now done since February. So they're very powerful institutions, but of course, in the hyper-financialization, the big thing that's happened is the emergence of private equity. And private equity is really leading the financial revolution. And if you look at what private equity means, it means disrupting the model of capitalism, of shareholder capitalism. Because private equity gets the money from private investors, buys up companies. The private equity takes part of the role of being a principal and part of the role of being an agent and asset strips the companies that private equity enters. It's a sort of parasitic form of capitalism. And it corresponds with the growth of the commodification of firms. When I was a student, you thought of the firm, your shareholders, workers. You didn't think of a firm as a commodity itself. But of course, it is a commodity today. And private equity has facilitated the conglomeration in every sector you can think about, and huge rents going as a result through economies of scale, economies of scope and network, etc., which you can show quite easily. And the hyper-financialization has been part of the incredible growth of inequality of the functional distribution of income. It's been a wealth transfer mechanism that's unprecedented in history. And this leads to my main story, I suppose, in today. I've taken a long time to get to it. I apologize for that. But I think it is important to see the context. Because what rentier capitalism and financialization has done, allied with technological change, allied with political decisions, allied with the whole neoliberal focus, is create a new global class structure, superimposed on old structures, but essentially the driving force of where we are today. At the top is the plutocracy, tiny number. We always hear about the 1% or the 0.1%, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that the upper classes have been earning is probably the wrong word, most, if not all of their money from rents, from physical property, financial property, intellectual property. They get it from rents. The plutocrats, the billionaires, have immense power, etc., and they have immense incomes that grow more by the day than the rest of the world in the whole of their lives put together. The day after Trump was re-elected, the top 9 billionaires in the United States gained an extra $84 billion, for example. Okay? Below the plutocrats are an elite who serve the plutocrats, salaried professionals, executives, who gain most of their income from buybacks and shares and property of various other kinds. And below them is the salariat. Now, when I was a student, essentially the prediction of the mainstream labor economists in the world is that by the end of the 20th century, the last century, the majority of people in rich countries in particular would be part of a salariat. That is, have high salaries, non-wage benefits, paid pensions, paid medical leave, paid, etc., etc. But of course, it's been shrinking all over the world. And one of the amusing things that's happened to me since the publication of my book, The Precariat, has been how many people, elderly people who are in the salariat in audiences, come down the aisle and say, "Can I buy 2 copies of your book?" And I say, "Why?" And they say, "I want one for my son and one for my daughter because they're not going to be entering the salariat." Underneath the salariat is the old proletariat, which is shrinking. But the important thing about it, in my narrative, is that the social democrats of the 20th century were parties and movements for the interests of the proletariat. And they developed a welfare system, Bismarckian or beverage-based social insurance, which was on a model of the proletariat. I won't go further into that, but they're shrinking everywhere. Unfortunately, for where we are politically today, the political parties have not adjusted to that. And it's underneath the proletariat the new precariat has developed. And underneath the precariat is a lumpen, an underclass, people dying out in the streets. I say that because some critics have said, I'm talking about an underclass. No, I'm not. I'm talking about a functionally needed group that is playing a positive, productive process, whereas a lumpenized underclass is not. They're acting as a threat to those above, but nothing else. Now, how do we define the precariat? The way I do so is to say it's defined in 3 dimensions. The trouble is that even today, 15 years after I wrote the book, commentators still say I'm talking about the first. They don't seem to recognize that it's multidimensional. And the first, of course, is unstable, insecure labor. That's the first part. It's the easy part. I never use the term precarious work, because that's different. It's insecure, unstable. People in the precariat are living bits and pieces lives. They've no occupational narrative or identity. There's no enterprise narrative or identity. And they also have to do an incredible amount of work for labor. Work that is not recognized as work, as labor. And they have to do a lot, increasing amount of work for the state. And they have to do work for retraining. It's now being called lifelong learning. They have to learn new boxes of tricks to keep going because their last box of tricks have become obsolescent. And we're sold a lie in the sense that suddenly lifelong learning looks so great, but actually, as I'm showing in my new book, it's a fraud. It's a fraud. Because what is being taught is to be better providers of human capital, but not to be emancipated in a better way. The incredible thing about this first dimension is this is the first mass class in history whose modal level of schooling, of education, is above the level of labor they can expect to obtain. Never happened before. So this creates a status frustration. It creates all sorts of perverse effects. And the irony is that as the development of credentialism has increased, the need for the level has gone down. I can show that in various ways. This is also a first class that is exploited off workplaces, outside labor hours, almost as much as inside. That's also a strange new phenomenon. And online labor, I call tasking, has increased. So the old concept of job has becoming gradually fading away. More and more labor is being done online, not in a job. Another little implication is that you cannot actually measure the size of your labor force from conventional statistics. If I pick up, I live in Switzerland, but I also work in Britain quite a lot. If I pick up a phone and try and get some service, I'll be talking to a lady with a slightly strange accent, and I'll ask her, and she said, oh, I'm working in Goa, or Accra, or wherever. And millions are like that. We know that, right? So the size, we have the export of labor without the export of laborers. Everyone talks about migration, but this is other phenomenon doesn't get enough attention. The second dimension is that if you're in the precariat, you have to rely almost entirely on money wages. You don't get the decommodifying non-wage benefits, paid holidays, paid medical leave, paid this, prospect of a pension. And those wages are increasingly volatile and have been declining in real terms, but disguised as such because the value of what you're losing in terms of non-wage benefits is not taken into account in most conventional income statistics. I had a piece in the Financial Times recently showing that the leaving out of that aspect distorts our growth of inequality because it's not given proper value. And the big thing about this second dimension, of course, is this is the first mass class in history which is being systematically exploited by debt. Anybody in the precariat is living on the edge of unsustainable debt. One error, one accident, one illness, you're likely to be homeless or destitute or suicidal or all three. That's a very new development. There's always been debt, of course there has, but systematic as part of a process of rent extraction. And this leads to the third dimension. The third dimension is that the precariat has distinct relations to the state. In a sense, the state is the primary antagonist for the precariat. No, unlike the boss or the employer. Often they don't even know who their employer is. And if they do, they don't expect that employer to be their employer the day after tomorrow, proverbially, right? So the state provides whatever they get or don't get. And what we've seen is a conversion of citizens into denizens, people who've been losing the rights of citizenship. Not just migrants, but people who are born and bred in their countries. They're losing civil rights, they're losing social rights, they're losing cultural rights, they're losing, most of all, political rights. Because they don't see in the political spectrum a party or movement representing their interests and needs. And this leads to the most important defining characteristic of the precariat. They feel like supplicants. The original word precarious was from the Latin, meaning to obtain by prayer. And that, I think, is important because the term precarious has been used when they really mean insecure. But this is different. It means you have to rely on favors. You have to rely on charity. You have to rely on discretionary decisions, be it landlords, employers, parents, the state. You don't have rights. And this, I think, is a fundamental aspect of the precariat. In the past 15 years, 14 years, because of the book, which has gone in 25 languages and numerous editions, I've been asked, I keep a record, not because I keep a record for wanting to keep a record, because I keep a diary and it's all on the computer. I've given over 800 presentations on the precariat in 49 countries. It doesn't happen to an ordinary, sensible human being, but it tells you about the fact that millions and millions of people feel they belong to the precariat. Every single day, without exception, I get emails from people to say, your book is about me. I always remember in Stockholm, one day when I was a huge audience, a man stood up. He said, I hate your book. Hate your book. I said, oh, sorry. He said, it's all about me. And he said, but it's about me. And I said, I'm sorry, but many people have said the same in less strident terms. So we have a situation where the precariat, when I wrote the book originally, the first edition, I said the precariat is a class in the making, not yet a class for itself. Those of you who are familiar with Marxism will know what I'm getting at. And a class in the making means that they know what they're against, but they're not unified in knowing what they want instead. And I wrote that essentially, unless politicians understood the insecurities and needs, on the page 1 of the book, the original edition, I said, unless it's understood, we will see the emergence of a political monster. And in 2016, I think I can tell this story. Maybe I'm breaking some rule or other. But in early 2016, I received an email inviting me to go and address the Bilderberg Group. Now, the Bilderberg Group is an offshoot, really, of the Mont Pelerin Society. It was set up in 1954. All the Western elite on the right, political, financial, and corporate. And they meet secretly in various destinations. And for me to be invited to the Bilderberg, I presumed it was a lefty friend like Jomo or somebody pulling my leg. So I took no notice. Thought, well, it must be somebody pretending. A couple of days later, I was in the kitchen and I got a phone call. We've sent you this invitation. You haven't responded. So I said, well, what's it all about? And they explained. So in the end, I consulted various friends of mine around Europe, and every single one of them said, you have to go. So I ended up going to Bremen, a castle, VIP treatment, a whole lot, armed guards and crazy. And I entered the room, and I was on the rostrum, and some of the most powerful people in the world, there they were. I was asked to talk about the Precariat. And the chair of my session was the chief executive of Deutsche Bank. And he said, this is the most famous session of this year's Bilderberg Group meeting because it's got out to the press that there's going to be a session on the Precariat, and they've worked it out that standing is here. And he said, but so boxing out of the left corner, he said, boxing out of the left corner. The guy's standing. So I stood up and I said, thanks very much. And there in the front, where the professor is sitting just there, staring at me with owl eyes, was Henry Kissinger with his pencil and paper. And I thought, this is interesting, because when I was a student, he was public enemy number 1. So over the next 3 days, I actually had several discussions with him, and I kept having the urge of grabbing him by the shoulder and saying, I'm making a citizen's arrest. So I had that urge. Anyhow, I gave this talk, and I said, don't be surprised if later this year, part of the Precariat in the United States votes for Donald Trump. Don't be surprised if in Britain they vote for Brexit. Don't be surprised if people like Orban and continue to win. And I said, basically, the Precariat is divided into, yeah, okay, thank you. I was hoping to have some such message. That basically the Precariat has been divided into 3 factions. The first faction is what I call the atavists. These are people who don't have a lot of education, formal education, but they come from old working class families or communities. And for them, yesterday was better than today. They feel they've lost the past. So populists can play on their emotions, that the sense of lost past. And then we'll vote neo-fascist. The second group is what I call the nostalgics. These are mainly the migrants around the world, they're main minorities and certain groups. These are people who don't have a home, they don't have a present anywhere, from where they came from or here. They are denizens. And they won't vote for fascists or populists. They tend just to keep their heads down and try and survive. Every day, few days, every few months, they may have days of rage when everything blows up in their lives. And the third group is what I call the progressives. These are the young educated who their parents and teachers say, go to university and you will have a future. You will have a career. And they know they're sold lottery tickets. Very few of them do have a future, and they know it. And they come out, of course, with a sense of lost future. There isn't a future. That this group won't vote for the Trumps or the neo-fascists, but they won't vote because we're not seeing a politics of paradise being offered. Now, during the 3 days of the Bilderberg meeting, because my name is Standing with an S, I was sitting in one of the, each person was sitting with one other person on a desk like this. I was sitting next to a man called Peter Thiel. Maybe some of you have heard of Peter Thiel. Now, the rule in Bilderberg group meetings is the Chatham House rule. So you're not allowed to say what anybody says to any outsider. So I will abide by that rule, right? I notice nobody can say I don't abide by it, please. But it's very interesting if you sit next to the man who in 2016 was the primary funder of Donald Trump, whose protege was a certain young J.D. Vance. And he's a multi-billionaire, close friend and partner with Elon Musk, and had written an article in 2009, so I can quote that, saying that democracy is incompatible with freedom. And the reason he gave, and this is not the only reason, that democracy was not compatible with freedom, is that women and vulnerable people in general will tend to vote for redistribution. They will tend to vote for policies that restrict the growth of the rentiers who are the wealth creators of the world. So democracy must go. He's not the only one who's been arguing that line. Several of the Mont Pelerin Society made it very explicit, including John Buchanan, who got a Nobel Prize, who believed that democracy should only be restricted to property owners, and only the rich should be members of government. Now, the interesting thing was, to my mind, being there that day, and those days, Lindsey Graham was in the audience and he asked to have breakfast with me. And I hate what they stand for. Hate what they stand for. But basically what I was saying was that they understood the precariat better than the left in the world. And they understood that you need to mobilize people for certain agendas. Meanwhile, I was appointed economic advisor to Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell in Britain, and I was trying to persuade them to develop an agenda for the precariat. And John kept telling me, and I'm seeing him when I get back tomorrow, day after tomorrow, he said, I can't articulate the precariat. I'm trying. And that's still the problem we have in politics around the world. And that leads to the point I want to make, and I'm skipping a lot of the other things because of running out of time. But besides the precariat, what we've got is a technological revolution and AI and all that stuff, which is increasing the rentier's income, increasing inequality, and increasing the amount of work. Increasing, but not labor. We have a new era of chronic uncertainty. Uncertainty to an economist is a very specific form of insecurity. It means unknown unknowns. We can all be hit by shocks, and our resilience and robustness is weak, fragile. This creates all sorts of morbid symptoms that we're experiencing. And we don't have a system to deal with uncertainty. Our social security systems, even in Sweden or Britain, anywhere, just isn't equipped for helping people to have ex-ante security. And we've seen a huge plunder of the commons around the world. I've written several books about the plunder of the commons, how the public wealth has been taken away and converted into private riches. And of course, besides accelerated environmental decay, which is huge, accelerated by finance. Finance is responsible for ecological decay, is not the solution. Yet every COP process, the ocean conference that I've just come from in Nice, they always say we must mobilize more finance. Well, finance is often the biggest cause of such delay. And the final point I want to make is that we have a situation where the transformation crisis point is rushing towards us, accelerated by what Trump is doing. Because the United States is the declining rentier state. The hegemon is in trouble. It cannot keep it going. And it's reached the final stage where it's become a plutarchy, ruled by the super wealthy in the interests of the super wealthy. The rising rentier state is China. It can play the long game. Mao Zedong wrote a famous essay in 1938 about protracted struggle, how a weaker element can beat a stronger one by playing it long. I think that's what's happening. But there are points of incredible danger that Trump is accelerating. I've written an article recently in which I'm saying that the most substantive, dangerous of his executive orders in the first 100 days was the one where he said, American companies can deep sea mine wherever they like. They can apply for licenses and they can deep sea mine in the area, as it's called. Time up. So I will finish. Give me 1 minute, if I may. The executive order says that American companies can, or subsidiaries of foreign companies, if they're registered in the US, can commence deep sea mining. Now, when China accepted UNCLOS in 1982, and unlike the United States, it has ratified UNCLOS alongside 167 other countries, it was essentially a complex set of agreements. China got a very small amount of EEZ, but in return, one of the things that China got and the G77 got at the time was the promise that if deep sea mining ever started, and it was blocked, it's still blocked in a principle, then there would be equitable sharing of the benefits for every country in the world, including landlocked countries. Pro rata. Okay? Now, if the United States unilaterally tears up a pillar of UNCLOS, you can guarantee there will be conflict in the Pacific, guarantee. Anybody betting against it is naive, would be naive. And I predict that there will be conflict not just in the Pacific and the Claverton area in particular to start with, but later in the Arctic and elsewhere. Because the Chinese can't accept that. It's fundamentally not right. And that leads me to the final point, which is that this plutarchy that's taken over the United States, in the framework that I've tried to develop, it was not only entirely predictable, but I predicted it. I don't think I was clever in predicting it. Because it's an alliance between the plutocrats, the plutocracy, and the atavistic part of the precariat, and the remnants of the old proletariat. This alliance was an alliance of opportunism, and the plutocrats promised bread and circuses to the plebs, in a sense, just like the Romans did. But they won't deliver that. And what will happen now, and we're seeing it every day, right, is that the plutocrats will resort to authoritarian tactics, demonizing groups, taking away freedoms from anybody who opposes, arresting politicians, roughing them up, as you've seen in the last few days, using language that induces murders, like we've just been seeing, all of which is echoing what happened in the 1930s in Germany and elsewhere. So we have a situation where we say to ourselves, the plutocrats have won, but they're going to have to resort to fascist tactics in order to continue to win. And this will lead to a social explosion, but it will only have a positive outcome if there's a new politics of paradise. And that's where we are today. And the young rebels, Jomo and myself, if we were the young rebels today, I would hope we would be trying to forge an agenda for the precariat. One that revives the commons, as I've written in The Politics of Time, my latest book. One that revives work without being in labor. One that gives dignity to women care work and gives value to care work. One that alters the boundaries of the way we live. We all want to work. We all want to involve ourselves in society. But the institutions and mechanisms have not been developed to do so. That is the challenge before us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Standing, for the presentation. From the disembedded phase of the global transformation to the emergence of a globalized rentier economy and the chronic insecurity facing the precariat, your analysis challenges us to rethink the foundation of our current economic order. To further enrich today's discussion, we now invite our esteemed discussants, Professor Jomo and Professor Melati, to join Dr. Guy Standing at the front. Please welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin with Professor Dr. Melati Nungsari, who will share her reflections on today's lecture.
All right, I have a lot of notes here. So I've been told we need to each keep it to 5 to 10 minutes because we want to hear basically from all of you. So I think the Q&A is sort of where the enriching stuff will come out. So we'll try to, I think, wrap this up and then give the floor to you all. All right, so a couple things, and maybe these are more kind of reflections and maybe questions, follow-up questions for you. So I thought, and I wanted to kind of bring this back to the context of Malaysia specifically. And as an educator, I feel like the first thing that I thought about was really within, the uncertainty, the existence of the precariat and all of that, really the function of universities and education within the system. So you had spoken a lot about how educational institutions and university have sort of promised this idea of career growth, of the ability to make more money once you go to university, the idea that invest in your education and then that will sort of pay off, right? And I feel like that in the Malaysian context, I feel like just to give some context of numbers, so in 2023 we had about 2 million underemployed people and graduates in Malaysia. So that essentially means people who went for master's degrees but are ending up in jobs that maybe didn't require them to invest that much in their education. We're facing a huge issue actually with people not wanting to kind of work in jobs that perhaps would pay them more in the Malaysian context and having them choose actually to go into more precarious, I guess, gig work type of stuff. So I guess within this, I did wonder what you thought about the general sense of the function of the university within the system. And maybe there's no function anymore, so we should talk about that. And then the second thing that I wanted to bring up was actually this idea of forced displacement. So I was looking up some numbers just now. So I feel like you spoke a lot about the Western hegemon kind of falling apart, which I completely agree, but I wanted to give the context of that in two countries like Malaysia. So overall we have 122 million displaced people. We have about 73.5 of them are internally displaced people. We have 42.7 million of them being refugees. And this number will keep on going up, right? We hear this idea of chaos, uncertainty. Prof. Jomo and I were talking about the potential of World War III, right? All of these kind of global insecurities will cause more people to be displaced. And because we had a conference studying refugee studies last week, I kind of wanted to highlight this in the context of Malaysia. So my colleagues and I just finished looking at the data for the past 20 years in the Malaysian context. And you should know that there is this problem of what we call permanent transit for a lot of refugees in Malaysia. So previously, the idea was that when displaced people come to us, the UN will settle this as a problem. They will kind of repackage everything and then send them back to the UK, to Europe, for people to be resettled. But the data actually shows in the past 20 years that 85% of resettlements outside, so out from Malaysia, actually were to the US. And the US has completely halted basically its refugee resettlement program, right? So we have probably about 250,000 of refugees in Malaysia, but if you look at migrants, so another population on the move, we have about 1 to 2, 3 million undocumented migrants in Malaysia, right? So where does that kind of leave us within this? So I feel like a lot of the talk about UBI, precariat, kind of relies on this idea of the rights of the citizens, right? But what about people who basically are not citizens, right? Can these concepts kind of be extended to populations who are not legal citizens, who are working informally? So I study informality, so this is something I'm quite passionate about, who are very politically excluded, but also socially excluded, right? So I feel like there's going to be a huge issue in the future with climate change, with political uncertainty, with a lot of these populations becoming larger and larger, and then rich Western countries basically not being able to step up as much as they did because of the political changes and stuff like that to help out countries that are actively trying to support these populations. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that as well. And then the third thing that I was thinking was really sort of coming back to this idea of generational mobility, I guess. And this kind of goes back to my first question. So when you're thinking about education, and now of course the refugee group and the informal population in Malaysia have zero rights effectively, so they can't go to public schools. We can't even talk about rights for them. But in general, there was a very large ongoing study by Raj Chetty of Stanford that kind of looked at how education improves lives, right? And it turns out that the Harvards of the world do not improve lives as much as the state university or the satellite school of some place, right? So I wonder whether you want to comment a little bit also, kind of connecting the two. Can education be mobilized for maybe in specific forms for populations like refugees, like migrants in this context, and how do kind of question 1 and question 2 tie together? So maybe we take answers and then I can pass it off to Jamal. Yeah, or you want to also ask questions? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you for those few comments. A man or woman should never write a book. If you write one book, you find you need to write another book, and because you haven't answered all the points you've raised in the book. And for my pains, I've just finished the book, which I hope is the completion of the cycle of books. And the title of the book is Human Capital, The Tragedy of the Education Commons. I hate the concept of human capital. I think it's it's a poisonous concept. And I think that we have had a distortion of education in the last 50 years. I mean, when I finished the book, I wrote the preface, and I wrote the preface saying, how can I justify writing a book about education? I'm not an educational specialist, you know. And then I said, well, I've been a professor in 3 universities. No, that doesn't sound good enough. I've been invited to give keynotes to big international education conferences. Well, that's a little plus. And then I started counting how many universities I've given lectures at in the last 14 years. I did it like counting sheep, you know, falling asleep, counting. So I fell asleep when I got to about 50. I woke up and then I did a further check, and it turns out 153 universities. And in every single university I've been to, I think, I can't think of any exceptions, there's been the same set of complaints, the same set of fears that the education system has been converted from what it was intended to be, a search for truth, a search for moral excellence, a search for respect for integrity and philosophy and values, to purely search for profit and me. And this has eroded the sense of social solidarity. It's eroded the capacity of the education system to resist populism, to resist tyrants. And this is taken further now, of course. J.D. Vance famously or infamously said the enemy is the universities, right? And they're showing that with what they're doing. But don't let's think that the elite universities like Harvard have been beacons of hope and respect. Back in 1980s, only 5% of graduates at Harvard wanted to go into finance. Today, it's well over half of all students at Harvard want to go into making money in finance, Wall Street, and their behavior is adjusted accordingly. The system has corrupted our capacity to be educated, and I think that's a terrible thing. On the displaced issues, the migration issues, we know that's the biggest tinderbox at the moment. The left, in my view, I would, it's a very broad term, is failing dramatically because it's playing along with the right. But it won't win them, but it'll never be far enough to the right. But it's lost the argument. It's not taking up the argument. I'm a migrant. Most of us are migrants, okay? We need migration. It enriches. It's one of the greatest things in humanity. We need to defend the principles of mobility and explain and say to everybody who's tempted to support the Trumps that the migrants aren't your problem. The migrants aren't causing your poverty and insecurity. And don't believe it from those Peter Thiel's et al. Saying that that's the case. They are the problem. And we have to say that more effectively with vocabulary to do so. So for me, I think this is a battle that is not being waged. Famous statement by Tsipras in Greece, and he failed that too. But we need to wage it, and we need to be courageous. And it's, at the moment, it's worryingly absent from public discourse.
Thank you. I think I'll give it to Jamal. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Melati, and thank you. Excuse me. Thank you to the Asian School of Business, and welcome back the new dean to the Asian School of Business. I'm particularly, I thought I would have much more areas of disagreement with Guy Standing. Much of our relationship has been involving debates about all kinds of issues, but I find myself very much in agreement, and also with Dr. Melati, particularly on the prospect of war. World War III may well have just started, and World War III has almost no limits because of all the limits which have been taken. So we might be sitting here in the final days of human civilization. We might be living in the final days of human civilization as we know it. Having said that, let me go straight to what Guy has said, and I'd basically like to compliment some of the things he has said by giving some suggestions for those of you who are interested in following up. There's been a very good book by Quinn Slobodian on the Mount Pelerin Society and its implications. And also, I think it's interesting to consider what happened with the last meeting of the Mount Pelerin Society last year, which was held in the Global South, in Delhi. And it was divided, at least from the perspective of the Indians who have joined the Mount Pelerin Society, by the fact that there is a global north-south divide. The Indians felt the racism in the hall, and this became very, very pronounced, and in some of the commentary. And this, I think, is quite telling, because in many ways we are living in new times where the north-south divide is becoming much more pronounced. And this, I think, is something which we need to think about. And I particularly want to draw attention to one of the considerations in relation to this later. But I think for those of you who are interested, it's well worthwhile for you to look at the study which Guy Standing did way back in the 1980s, if I remember correctly, because it has been grossly underutilized. It is a very useful study of enterprises. There's, of course, because he was at that time coming as an ILO expert. The attention is very much to labor flexibility issues. But you can see that in many ways it begins to anticipate the whole question of the precarity of labor. He began with a story about how the whole question of working in the Motorola factory was, you were not expected to work for very long. I happen to have had a cousin who was working in one of these factories, and she had to leave after 3 years. And this was the general fate of many of the, so this was the general condition of labor. Now, remember that in this period, in the 1980s, the bulk of the manufacturing labor force in Malaysia was actually female. And this, I think, has to be considered when we are trying to understand how gender is used. And the fact that although they were not formally, they were not they were not required to leave after 3 years, the very fact that they were very vulnerable meant a lot. So for those of us, for example, from Penang, you see a lot of people coming in from Kedah. And I got into a debate with somebody who was criticizing the Green Revolution in the Muda area, because the Green Revolution in the Muda area was resulting in a lot of women being displaced from certain types of work. And it's true, the work was that of transplanting from the nursery to the main field, and also harvesting. This is less true of Muda, but very significant for Kelantan, where most of the harvesting work was done by women. This was celebrated, this was criticized from an ostensibly pro-women perspective. But I would emphasize that this work was huge, was back-breaking. I remember when the late James Scott did his work in the southern Kedah. He was working, and after 20 minutes, he had to give up trying to thresh the paddy. He challenged me to do so, to try to do the work. And I have to confess, I gave up after 15 minutes, okay? Scott had been there. He's much older than I am, but he had been there and been doing this for quite some time when we encountered. Now, what I think needs to be emphasized about the precariat is that the condition of labor flexibility and precariousness is not something terribly new, especially in the global south. The kinds of conditions which were guaranteed, of employment which is guaranteed, and so on and so forth, was a feature of parts of the global north, but less so in the global south. And I think this is very important for us to recognize. Allow me to go to a second issue, and that's the question which I fully understand Guy Standing was not able to address directly, and that's the question of stagnation. But I think his analysis lends itself to explaining why we have seen growing economic stagnation, and especially in the last decade and a half. The last decade and a half has seen growing stagnation, which has been normalized in the global north. And you have policies which have been adopted by governments which deliberately strengthen the tendencies towards economic stagnation. And this is, to me, very, very worrying. And the ability of the fund, but especially the bank, to influence policies in this direction is hugely problematic. So we now have a situation where the fund, Kristalina Georgieva, and more importantly, perhaps Gita Gopinath, the first deputy managing director of the fund, have both been talking about the tendency for the fund, for the tendency towards stagnation, and they have been trying to offset that. They were, Madam Georgieva was more silent during the period when she had to seek renewal and approval of the Biden administration, but she has been very, very clear about this. I'm running out of time, so I won't get into all this, but I think there are many tendencies which Guy Standing has emphasized, which contribute towards economic stagnation. And by continuing to accept the premises of fund thinking, at least traditionally, we now have a situation where it is very likely that we are going to deepen the stagnationary and contractionary tendencies in the world. I've tried to argue this in some of the writing, for example, on how climate policy, CBAM, and various other policies which have been promoted in the north are actually going to contribute to stagnation. And this situation is, of course, much worse in the south, where there has much less room to offset those tendencies. Let me get to the third point, and that is the whole question of rentier capitalism. Guy Standing correctly reminded us of the role of Peter Thiel, but I would like to remind you of an article Peter Thiel put in the Wall Street Journal op-ed page in 2014, where he wrote, "Competition is for losers. Competition is for losers." In other words, monopoly is the way to go. Okay, this is a blatant celebration. And this is where I think we now have a very interesting conflict, because you have the continued celebration of neoliberalism, not only by the Mount Pelerin Society, but also by a great number of others, whereas in fact, there have been monopolistic and oligopolistic tendencies in the world economy for us at least a century and a half. If you look, for example, at John Stuart Mill's work, he was acknowledging that there was a tendency towards concentration. And this was pursued by people like John Hobson, who emphasized how this was leading to the concentration of capital, as to use the term Hobson used, was leading to not only to some stagnationist tendencies, but also contributing to imperialism. So I think it's very important for us to recognize how, in a sense, we are being caught in a perfect storm, where we are almost, our capacity for agency is very, very much limited. And this, I think, forces us to think about the implications for moving forward and for getting ourselves out of this mess. And this is precisely why I think it is important to think about many of these issues, the issues which Guy Standing has emphasized today, but also to note the possibility of positioning ourselves much more firmly in the global south in our attempts to move forward. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you to our esteemed discussants for the insightful sharings. We now open the floor for questions. Just a quick note, during the Q&A session, please raise your hand, and once acknowledged, use the built-in microphone in front of you. Simply press the button to activate to green light before speaking. So we now open the floor for questions. Yes, please welcome.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a very rich discussion. Happy to see ASP hosting that, Professor Guy. My name is Renato. I'm also a faculty here at Asia School of Business. And also glad to see Professor Jomo back and in this discussion with Melati. My question is about, and to use a Gramscian term, what is the new hegemon? So we've seen a thorough discussion of what we don't like, or at least what you don't like, the origins of it, the intellectual origins, Mont Pelerin, and I have to say that within the Mont Pelerin, there were intense discussions within intellectuals. So James Buchanan is not totally aligned with Hayek, who was also not totally aligned with Mises, and famously Mises stormed out of a meeting saying that everyone there was a socialist. So there are nuances there. But within a Gramscian world, where we are today, and given the rise of other powers such as China, India, do we have an alternative framework, a core of ideas elaborate enough to say that here is the alternative? Just as Thatcher got slashed the book, The Constitution of Liberty, this is what we think, are you implying that I should get one of these and say, this is what we think as a solution? Or are we still looking for those answers and those thinkers that can put together a framework that people can actually rally together in different parties, in different intellectuals, defending ideas and so on. Is this a missing piece in today's discussion of where do we go from here?
Thank you for the comments. I believe we do have the nucleus of response. I wrote a sequel to the Precariat called a Precariat Charter. And I, in a moment of arrogance, if you like, I said, how can I answer the following question? If today, this was in 2014, I said, if today I was designing a set of demands, a set of institutional changes for the Precariat, what would it look like? And would it differ from what would have been a similar charter for the proletariat 100 years before? And I came up with 29 policies that were key to my view of what would appeal to the progressive part of the Precariat. The book is published, it's been translated into many languages as well. At the moment, I think, and this is a point that Jomo has just made, we have a sense in which we don't have agency. And I think that is partially still correct, but is changing rapidly. We're having an incredible revolution from below in the commons, commoning, commoners, civil society groups gradually forming. They're often mixed with ecological movements, with feminist movements, with minorities. I believe that it's taking shape remarkably quickly. If you look back into the 19th century, similar phase, the time it took for effective response to the crisis that was being created by financialization then was much longer than it's taking now. So I'm not too pessimistic, but of course it's going to be a close run thing. Now that leads me to a point that my life work, for what it's worth, my life work has been devoted to one particular policy. And I've supported it and first formed a network in 1985-86. We called ourselves Bien. Then was the Basic Income European Network. Young philosophers, lawyers, economists. But by 2004, when we had our 16th Congress in Barcelona, so many people from developing countries had joined that I pushed, and it's changed name, it's remained Bien, except the E became Earth, the Basic Income Earth Network. And you're listening to a man who's had the privilege or the stupidity, call it what you like, to have been able to put into practice and test something in which he believes. And we've done pilots and experiments on basic income in many countries. Our biggest one was in India, but we also in Southern Africa, in Brazil, in Finland, just completed one in Wales. There are more than 100 experiments ongoing at the moment. As I sit here, I seem to be getting regular calls from people involved. Many of them are against the system. Incredibly, the 50 US states, the mayors have come out in support of doing pilots, so much so that the right-wing Republicans in various states have lobbied to have them banned, which I always think is a good sign for that they're having good effects. And as I was saying in the talk to the conference that's just been concluded, every single pilot and experiment that we've been doing, or others have been doing, have shown the same sort of results, even though the methodologies have differed and so on, in different types of country, different types of community. They always result in improvements in mental health, in physical health, in nutrition, in schooling, school attendance, school performance, increase of work, an improvement of status of women, an improvement of status of people with disabilities. It's not a panacea, but it must be seen as part of a response to give people basic security, to enhance their freedom. And as I said in the talk I gave day before yesterday, I have a particular story. In 2016, our Congress was in Seoul, and a man came up to me and he said, "Dr. Stanley, please, could you explain what basic income means? Please." He asked me a lot of questions. I answered as best I can. He said, "I am convinced. I am going to stand to be governor of my province on a basic income platform." I said, "Well, good luck, good luck." He said, "Would you write a newspaper article?" I said, "Yeah." So I wrote an article. He stood. And the next Congress that we had was in Hyderabad. And this time he came with an entourage because he'd become governor of his province. And he introduced a basic income for all young people aged 16 to 25. All young people. And he told me about how people were working harder and more, better education and so on. I said, "Okay." And then he said, "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "I'm going to stand to become president." I go, "Oh, okay. Good luck. Good luck. Would you write?" "Yeah, I got it. I'll write your articles," yes. So he stood for president. And we next had a Congress in Seoul in 2022. And he came. He came to the front. Stood. He's a small man. Stood there. And he said, "I failed." And I put my hand up to go to the rostrum. And I said, "You did not fail. You got 49.5% of the vote. Most politicians would give their left arm to get 49.5% of the vote." And a few days after, he was stabbed in the street. We thought he was going to die. But he didn't die. 2 weeks ago, he became president of South Korea on a platform of basic income. That's where we are today. I said this to the Prime Minister Anwar the day before yesterday in my speech afterwards. I say things could change very quickly. If we want something, we can fight for it, fight in the intellectual sense. But we are, as Jomo has just emphasized, we are genuinely in the point of the threat of the annihilation of civilization. It's not an exaggeration at all. And we have to be brave intellectually and politically. And I think that is coming through. But it's coming through in a messy sort of ways. We need to revive the commons. We need to share more. We need to revive social solidarity. All the things that are feasible. We need a transformation of education. We need real education back. So I think we are at a point, and your point is about the Mont Pelerin society being divided in different ways. And Jomo's point about Peter Thiel's article. Peter Thiel, in that article, the 2014 article, he actually basically proposes what Elon Musk has put into effect, Doge, dismantling of the state. And he's imposed to multiculturalism. He's opposed to the state. And he's a racist. He's also a eugenicist, as is Musk. And a eugenicist who believes in the survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest as being a way of letting the weak and the vulnerable, they can all die out. We will survive. That's why Musk has 14 children, because he thinks his brilliant seed must be spread. These people are mad. But we have to be brave enough to be saying that and articulating alternative. Whereas the Democrats in the US have failed that, the Labour Party in Britain is failing that. We're seeing dead men walking, Gramscian terms. And I think we are at a very dangerous point. But there is an agenda that's being developed, and that's the key point.
All right, if I may, I'd like to come back to the gentleman I acknowledged earlier. You can ask your question. Please welcome.
Hello, Prof. My name is Evan. I was the former deputy project director of the Malaysian Public Policy Competition last year and was part of Team Malaysia for the International Economics Olympiad. So I have two quick questions. One is, based on your research and experience, are there any countries or a country that was the closest in terms of social policies, such as universal basic income, which I think you mentioned, or any other sort of policies that are closest to that, since you mentioned a few other countries? And secondly, you mentioned that due to the issues that you have mentioned, it's created a political monster. And why do you think that this sort of political monster tends to attract, I guess, more populist, far-right political agendas rather than far-left populist agendas? Thank you.
Well, then, shall I answer that? Yes?
Yeah,
in a sense, I've answered your question in response to the previous one, so I won't go in on at length. I think the one point that's relevant to your question is that so far the political right, the Trumps and the Orbans and the Modis in India, for example, they've offered a certain certainty. They've offered something specific, It's racist. It's really very fundamentally racist. It's eugenicist, as I've just said. But they offer something. So far, the opposition to them has been trying to put back the old social democratic consensus, which they won't succeed, and it doesn't attract the progressive part of the Precariat. So I don't think that we're seeing them dying out. We're in a Gramscian interregnum politically, where the new is not quite ready to be born. That Gramscian thought. So I think that really that's where we are today, and it's up to your generation, if I may say so, to be the new leaders in this direction. And we need your energy. We really need your energy. But I'm feeling that energy is growing. I really genuinely do.
Yes. I think we're going to have one last question. I saw that, yes, Mr. Wan Faisal? Yeah, okay, I see you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Guy Standing. And I had the privilege of attending many of your lectures when I was in London 7 years ago. And my question is about politics. And we all know that you have introduced some of the most powerful concepts that could really ignite social movement worldwide. But sadly, as you said, many in the left had not able to really capitalize on your conceptual tools to really empower the precariats, especially among the youngsters, especially. And I believe the same thing in Malaysia, where the discourse about labor issues and socialism are not really in the mainstream in politics. So maybe I would like to seek your view. Has there been any attempt from religious leaders or scholars, whether Christian, from Christianity, from Islam, from Buddhism, had forged a dialogue with you to explore, some sort of common ground on how to empower the voters from religious point of view? First. Secondly, to Prof. Jomo and Dr. Melati, being Malaysian yourself, you know very well there are gaps in our local politics with regard to this issue. In fact, for record, in my inaugural debate in Parliament, I spoke about this. But of course, no one responded to me in Parliament. So I think there are people who are willing to champion these issues, especially when I was a Deputy Youth and Sports Minister. I saw myself the reality of precariats among Malaysian youth. Just that, we need more dialogue and discussion, and it has to be affected through political actors as well. So like it or not, in Malaysia, the left is almost non-existent. So you have to dialogue with people like my party in order to inform the citizen what are the importance of such discussion. So may I seek your view, Professor Guy Standing, and also Prof. Jomo and Dr. Melati. Thank you.
Let me just give a brief answer, because somebody else would like to talk, I think. On the religious points, I think with the case of basic income, I think it's a powerful argument about religious justice. I'm not religious myself, but I can appreciate that argument. And very strangely, I got a call in the early phase of COVID, and it was from a group working for the Vatican. And they asked me about basic income, and they said, well, the Pope is interested. And then the next thing happened, Pope Francis wrote a letter, public letter, effectively coming out in favor of basic income as a way of sharing our common inheritance. But I also appreciate the argument that if there's a God, then God has given us unequal talents, unequal skills. And as a compensation, a basic income would be a way of compensating those who don't have the skill of making a lot of money. But then I got another approach from a totally different perspective. I got approached by the Palestinians in Ramallah. I've been working with them over the last 18 months or whatever. And they said, could you design an emergency basic income for the West Bank and Gaza? And I said, well, we can see genocide is taking place. It's a rather hopeless case. It seemed less hopeless then than it does today. And I said, but I'll do it. I'll work with you, and I'm happy to do so. So we designed, and I've issued the report, and I've become very familiar with all the horrific issues there. I weep every day. I mean it. And I think that you can justify that from an Islamic theological perspective, and I interacted with some very distinguished people, the Khalidis and so on, in that process. I think we can mobilize various religions in this direction, particularly in the context that Jomo highlighted.
Yeah, if our panel would like to add on to the question.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, thank you, Yang Berhormat. Let me suggest that firstly, the disappearance of the left is not entirely its own doing. It was the government which basically suppressed the left, especially from the mid-1960s. And the left at that time included leaders such as the late Dr. Burhanuddin. In fact, it was the left which first demanded independence in 1945 after the Japanese surrendered. All this is suppressed from the consciousness of most Malaysians. It is not, none of it is ever published, certainly not in textbooks. So this, I think, the recovering knowledge of the history of the left, what it has had to offer, is part of the problem. I just came back a couple of days ago, part of the reason why I have a bad cough and so on, and from Jakarta. And in Jakarta, I found, to my pleasant surprise, the kind of discussions which were going on were so far ahead of us. The main reason in Malaysia is, of course, ethno-populism. Ethno-populism, which has been deliberately promoted by political parties of all tendencies, okay? And we find that for all intents and purposes, the discourse in Malaysia is so backward, and we cannot have a decent discussion about many of the issues which has been raised by in the discussions today. I sometimes, many of my friends ask me, why are you writing about world issues and you don't write anymore about Malaysia? In a way, maybe I've given up. I've given up because, you spend a lifetime trying to do something, and basically you don't get anywhere. But there's, of course, the real existential threat we have of the prospect of war, but also the deliberate policies which have been implemented in recent years. And so now, in my opinion, I'm not sure everybody will agree with this, we have a unique position where, as you correctly point out, the left is so weak and the right is able to fight among itself. Okay? Between the neoliberals, the people of the Mount Pelerin Society and others, and the new right of the various characters which were identified by and we have a situation where they will fight it out, but at the end of the day, they will probably unite. I mean, let's face it, neoliberalism was a lot of rhetoric, promise. They were never serious about competition. What Mr. Peter Thiel has just made very explicit what was the case. So we have a situation right now where the most influential group of people are the people identified by Guy Standing earlier, including the so-called tech bros. Who are these tech bros? Many of them are South African in origin, and they have particular views of the world. And we like to think of ourselves as different, but in fact, we subscribe to that kind of mindset. So I frankly I'm not even sure it's really worthwhile to talk to your party. No, seriously, I mean, the person who created the other ideas, okay? Basically, they identified with the Conservative Party of the UK, and they have a particular view of the world. And we do not have, here we are trying to, even a conservative from the Conservative Party of the UK, Professor, what's his name? The professor that he was just given up his professorship at Must before. He said, Jeffrey Williams, yeah. Jeffrey Williams says proudly that he was an advisor to the Conservative Party, a leading member of the Conservative Party. He studied at the same place Professor Standing studied at Cambridge, but he says that the rules of health financing are very different, because the first lesson he took, the first class in economics he took at Cambridge was why health does not lend itself to so-called market logic. Okay, and this is why he sees health as a great exception. But we have people who basically write reports on everything. They go from one company to, they go from one country to another, and they basically, we've actually found reports where you do a cut and paste. Okay, you do reports for country A, and then you do a word search and replace that's the kind of nonsense which goes on. The English is good, the examples are interesting, and so on and so forth. But that's the kind of this cult of the consultancies. Okay, so we have a huge problem intellectually, but we do not have any significant discussion and debate going on about these kinds of matters. So this is part of the problem, I feel. And rather than contribute to that problem, you might want to consider being part of the solution.
I don't have anything to add, but I did, the thing you said about working on Malaysian issues for so long and sort of feeling like you're kind of hopeless. There's a very good book out there, so I'm going to recommend a book. If you have not read any of Professor Khoo Kay Kim's work, Malaysian historian, he has this very interesting quote at the beginning of, I think, one of his books, and I wanted to end on this very pessimistic note. But he says, to love a country, in this case Malaysia, is really to be kind of constantly heartbroken. So up to the young people to solve this, but that's all I'm going to say.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions. Can we go to, yeah, please proceed.
Hello, my name is Bruno Pereira. I'm the founder and the General Secretary of the Electronic Industry Employees Union Peninsula Malaysia. We were finally granted a certificate to set up the union in the electronic industry in 2010, after fighting the system for 35 years. I think Professor Jomo is very familiar with my struggle, and he was one of the first people who gave a ceramah to form an electronic union in the electronic industry, the first in-house union, which formed the RCA. Now, what I want to ask regarding this lecture is that when you talk about precarious labor, of course, it's very pronounced in the electronic industry. Nearly 40% of the workers who are direct labor, that is rank and file, migrant labor. The other 60% are Malaysian women in the electronic industry. And that is my membership. So we have collective agreements where we negotiate with the employer on the terms and conditions of service, besides the statutory provisions and the labor management dialogue. Now, coming to the component of the collective agreement is the wages, the monetary part of it. Now, when you talk about basic income, it comes to my mind, why can't I have that in the factories that we have organized? So we initiate negotiation with the company. And these companies are basically Japanese companies, which currently we have. The American companies, of course, shut us off. There's another story. They refuse to open the books. They refuse to tell us how much profit they're making, what's the cost of labor, and what is there for the workers' distribution of income. How are they based? Nothing I can find in the company accounts. And we are shut out of that. So how can I negotiate the wage structure, the bonus and the increment, the productivity, if all these data are kept away from us? If you look at the company accounts, you'll find the cost of labor, the bulk of the company's income account is in the cost of labor, and there are no notes on it. We wrote to the company said it's confidential. We wrote to the industrial court. Now this case is in court. And the industrial court said, oh, I can't help it, the company don't want to give. You just bring it up during your what do you call it, in your litigation. So we don't know how it's going to change. This case will be heard in December. So I'm at wit's end. What am I to do? How am I to negotiate when my legs and hands are tight? And this is not only peculiar to me. It has been going on since a union established collective agreement in this country, since before I was born. So where are we going with trade union? And we talk about workplace democracy. We don't have. We don't have. So what we have is a race to the bottom. The wages are going down. Everything is going down, and the company says, "I got no money to pay you." One interesting fact: I took the company's invoices of products, electronic products, diodes selling to their mother company in Japan. I Googled the selling price. Here they are selling 1,000 units of the diodes are sold for 1,000 ringgit to the headquarters. I took the part number and Googled Amazon as a buyer. 1,000 units for 4 ringgit, $1. When I Google in Amazon as a buyer for the same part number, 1 unit is sold as 4 ringgit. So we're selling 1,000 units to the headquarters for 4 ringgit, and they're selling 1 unit in the open market for 4 ringgit, 4,000 times. How am I to prove this? Can I bring it to the court? My lawyer says you can't, because these are confidential information. Where do you get it? The person who gave you the information, the company will be sued. So Professor Guy Stanton, can you, just a question, your system of basic income, how can we translate for trade unionists for bargaining in the work floor? Thank you.
Yes. Yes, the panel. Any panel that would like to raise the question? Yeah.
I'll just answer the specific question. I don't believe we will see a rise in real wages, as an average real wages, as the solution to insecurity and poverty. I think we have King Canute in mind, holding back the waves. I think a lot of changes are meaning that we need a new system of distribution. And why I think a basic income is part of the answer to the predicament that you're talking about is that it would strengthen the bargaining position of all workers if they have a guaranteed floor on which they can depend as a basic income, as an economic right. One remark that allowed me to mention this was the Prime Minister said the other day, and I sat next to him for half an hour to discuss this. He said that his ambition was to raise the labor share of GDP from 32% of the total income to 45%. I don't think he will succeed in that, okay? But if it's a genuine ambition to increase the share of total income going to people who are performing labor and work, then a basic income is a potentially effective way. And what you can do in this country, again, going back to the pessimism of Jomo, taking that into account, is there's a debate about subsidy rationalization, okay? Well, that means the money is there. The money is there. It's a matter of saying, well, if you're going to roll back subsidies, good, but you must do something with the money that is good. And I believe in moving taxation to an eco-fiscal strategy. We need high carbon tax. We need that. The trouble is it's regressive, and it's not popular because it's regressive. The only way to make it progressive and popular is to say that the revenue generated from that type of tax, not just carbon tax, but others that I listed, must be recycled in the form of dividends to ordinary people. And that, I think, is an essential way of getting into this debate in a country like Malaysia. And I would agree that with Jomo that Indonesia and Thailand, strangely enough, the debate is going much further and much faster. The biggest party in parliament in Thailand at the moment is Basic Income Party. So we are seeing some progress in this region, and I believe it's the region where it could happen most.
Yes. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we have to wrap up the Q&A session for now. Thank you all for your engaging questions and to our panel for the meaningful discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, as we near the close of today's program, we would like to take a moment to show our appreciation to our distinguished speaker. First, we would like to invite Professor Dr. Melati Nungsari on behalf of the Asia School of Business to present a token of appreciation to Dr. Guy Standing. Please welcome.
There's a story here. So to tell you the story first, she was working with a lot of refugee female entrepreneurs, and this was written by them. So a piece of that. Thank you very much.
Next, may we invite Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram on behalf of Khazanah Research Institute to also present a token of appreciation to Dr. Guy Standing. Yes, okay. Please welcome.
I'd also like to express my appreciation to the Employees Provident Fund for kindly agreeing to have Professor Standing with us today. It is very, very important. They did all the heavy lifting in bringing Professor Standing here.
Yes, thank you, Prof. Jomo. And finally, to commemorate this meaningful collaboration between our two institutions, we invite Professor Jomo and Professor Melati to join in a token exchange on behalf of KRI and ASB, respectively. Please welcome.
Like Christmas. Like Christmas. I think your punk people probably want the other side. Because it says KRI. Sorry. Media training. I just wanted to also thank Prof. Jomo for giving us the opportunity to host this. So we thank KRI and thank Prof. Jomo, and we look forward to future collaborations with KRI.
And thanks also to the team.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Melati, Professor Jomo, and Dr. Guy Standing. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of our seminar. On behalf of Khazanah Research Institute and the Asia School of Business, we thank Dr. Guy Standing, our discussants, and all our guests for making this morning a stimulating and meaningful one. Thank you once again for your participation. We wish you a pleasant day.